In this section, we're going to review what's referred to as Gestalt psychology. And Gestalt psychology is something that emerged largely in Germany around the same time that psychology itself was emerging from philosophy. It stands in contrast to structuralism. That's pretty much its, they were antagonists back in those days. Structuralism, functionalism, pragmatism, they're all terms that probably aren't even studied today in philosophy. Structuralism was identified with the French. Pragmatism and functionalism were identified with Americans. You can imagine pragmatism being something that Americans would latch onto and invent. Pragmatism was advanced by philosophers George Herbert Mead and John Dewey and psychologist William James. Gestalt psychology stood in contrast to structuralism. Structuralism had to do with essentially the earliest form of psychology experimentation was structural, and it involved sensation and perception. So what the structuralists wanted to do was figure out how perceptions were built from basic elements and how there was a sort of a chemistry or a structure to the mental functions. Well, Gestalt psychologists felt that there was no breaking down of perceptions, no breaking down of processing, that the whole is greater than its parts. And Gestalt psychology refers to holistic sort of perception as opposed to breaking down perception into components. And they brought forth a number of interesting illusions and perceptual aspects that do involve holistic perception. I think today Gestalt psychology is pretty much incorporated into general models of spatial reasoning. I mean, all their illusions and so on have to do with how your brain integrates perceptions into whole perceptions as opposed to component parts. And you have a great bias toward perceiving good form in just about everything that you see or hear. And Gestalt psychologists focused on that and said, well, you really can't break this down into components. This whole perception is what's important and not component parts. All right, well, I'm going to go through some of the basic concepts in Gestalt psychology and review each one. Okay, well, the first one I'm going to review is the Gestalt principle of pragnance. And pragnance is the tendency we all have to perceive what we consider good form or good figure. And here you see an example of this very clearly. You can see examples of this everywhere. We tend to impose forms onto the contours that we perceive, and we tend to want to make everything fit within the good form models that we've built over time. Well, here you see the Olympic circles, and we look at the bottom image after you've seen the top one. It's very hard for you to look at that image as just partial circles and the visual forms that make up that image. You can't really break down that image into its component parts. It's always going to be perceived as the Olympic circles, even if there's some attempt to break it down and separate things. The best I can do, if I try to look at this some different way, is to look at the bottom image as if it's sort of two Mickey Mouse pictures. You know, you've got kind of two ears at the top and two faces below. But even then, I'm still obeying the law of pragnance, because I'm now, instead of looking at it as the Olympic rings, I'm now looking at it as Mickey Mouse faces. I can't break that down into a component part and say, well, I'm just looking at this component part in and of itself. I'm always integrating things into composite images if I can. And this tendency, this bias, is referred to as the law of pragnance. It's a very compelling aspect of Gestalt psychology. It sort of establishes Gestalt psychology clearly different from structuralism, and certainly establishes spatial processing as very unique from what the structural psychologists were trying to make it into. Here's another law referred to as the law of similarity. And here you see there's a tendency to group things by their similar structure. I think this is actually kind of a version of the law of good form, but you can see where it's a little bit different. If you look at the display on the left, you see that these dots aren't groupable. You don't have a sense that they're grouped at all. It's there's nothing to distinguish a contrast between the figures. They're all the same. It looks like a large block of dots. But if you go to the figure on the right, there's the same number of forms there, but once I separate the circles from the squares, I now have columns of squares and columns of circles. and I've clearly designated them by their grouping as the same form. And now this array has integrity as a form or as a groupings of objects, whereas on the left figure I can't do that at all. Here's an example here of the law of good continuation. Again, I think this is an extension of the law of good form, but it's applied in a way that's different than the examples given before. Here you notice that there are pipes. There are big pipes in this factory, or this facility here. Now notice that the pipes, if a pipe comes in front of another one, you don't think of the back one as going up or something and away from the one in front that's hiding it. You think of the pipes as being continuous all the way through. But as you think about it, the pipes actually could, there could be two pipes there. And they're just, the intersection there has just been obscured by a pipe in the front. Well, there's a tendency that we have to maintain good form by maintaining good continuation. And we tend to think that objects are continued unless we have evidence otherwise. Okay, here you have the law of proximity. And I'm going to form a shape on the left over here because there's a proximity difference between the elements. The shape I'm going to form is that of a row. So I see rows here clearly on the left side because the circles are close together. I tend to form them into a shape or a form, which is the row. And because they're far from the next row down, I've structured this whole thing as a set of rows. And I've done that because of proximity. It's very, very hard for me not to do this. I implicitly do this because I want to form shapes, I want to form contrasts, I want to make objects in the world have contours, and so I want to find lines and shapes when I can. And I'm strongly biased to do that. I'm so biased I really cannot dissociate the proximity from rows. Now, if you go to the figure on the right there, you also tend to organize this in rows because of proximity, even though before, when they were different like this, you structured this as columns. However, I find it very hard to structure these as columns. I can kind of do it. Clearly, the contrast in the form of a circle versus a square gives me a pretty strong cue that I might be able to do that. But what's fighting against it, though, is the proximity rule. I tend to associate these in rows still because of the proximity. But if I really force it, I can try to perceive the right figure as a set of columns because I have another contrast by forms. So anyway, you've got two laws here working. In the when you have similar shapes, you tend to form a structure, but also when you have proximity, you tend to form a structure. And in B, you have a confusion there, and you have proximity. In my mind, proximity kind of prevails when I look at this. I still form this as rows, and it's very, very hard for me to get out of that bias. Now here you have another law of meaningfulness or familiarity. I think today we would consider this the role of memory in the perception, in imposing perception. If you recall the case of the man in one of the movies who couldn't recognize his own face, how compelling faces are in our memory system and our perceptual system. Some people even believe that there's an inherited predisposition for the perception of faces, and clearly infants will prefer faces over other objects very, very early in life. Whether this is inherited or not, who knows? It's a hard thing to prove. But at any rate, when you look at this picture here, here's an artist who has built a style based upon the perception of faces. And if you look at this long enough, you'll begin to see faces. And I won't tell you where they are. I don't even remember how many faces are in this image, but it's quite a few. This artist has a lot of work like this. There's a lot of work with faces in it, other objects. This happens to have faces. Some of her artwork will have, for example, a scene like this in which there are horses or other kinds of animals. If you look at this long enough, though, you're going to see faces that will come out at you, even though what's ostensibly here is just a set of boulders and rocks. Once you see a face, it's very, very hard to turn it back into rocks. It's always that face is going to pop right out and be a face no matter what. And once that begins to happen for that set of rocks, that perception will stay there. This is a really good example of how meaningfulness and familiarity gets imposed on perception. Now, this is kind of obviously an artificial example. These images really don't exist. But it does remind me of people looking at clouds and seeing things in clouds and imposing sort of an order or form on clouds. And certainly I've done that before. It's a common thing that we think of doing, and it's depicted a lot in our culture. So we take an ambiguous stimulus like the cloud, we see things that are familiar in it. We see things that look like faces and so on. And that becomes the imposition or the bias that we have in perceiving the ambiguous stimulus of the cloud. This is a very interesting example of imposing order and meaning on perception. This is not one that the Gestalt psychologists referred to. I found this one somewhere in some textbook somewhere about perception. But it clearly represents the principle. Here you see two pictures of the Mona Lisa. Now, if you look at those pictures, you can tell the picture on the right looks different than the picture on the left. But really make a judgment about whether it looks that unusual or not. And we're going to see then in the next slide whether it looks strange or not. As I look at the two here, I can see it looks different, but I don't have any perception it looks particularly strange. It looks like the artist has simply painted a different expression on the right one rather than the left one. Now go to the next slide and we'll see if it's distorted or not. Whoa, now you can see that it's really distorted. That picture on the right is the same picture that was in the previous slide, except it was upside down. Now what that picture on the right represents is the mouth turned upside down and the eyes turned upside down. Now because you have imposed a certain perception on the previous slide, you didn't see those upside down eyes as particularly distorted because they were truly upside down and the figure was upside down. And you impose your previous perception of faces and how they're structured got imposed on that previous image to the point where you did not see it as distorted. And you should go back to the previous image and take a look at it. You'll be surprised at how it looks natural. And here it clearly is very distorted when they're actually the same picture. This is a good example of how expectation for facial structure, expectation for where the shadow should be, the eyes, the pupils should be in the eyes and things like that, gets imposed on the perception, and you will tend to see it as a normal face unless you're confronted with something clearly distorted like the one here. Now we see a demonstration of another principle referred to as the principle of common region. And here we tend to see things as grouped if they appear to be in the same territory. They seem to be in the same area. Now, given that we want to see forms, we want to see shapes, we want to see things that are grouped and things that are not. We want to have a contrast in our perception that enables us to see forms better. So here we have something called the principle of common region, and this principle, forms are shaped by their having a common territory or region. And we'll see this example really reinforced by looking at the next slide, in which the regions are going to be circled. They're going to be set aside. So take a look at the next slide and you'll see how the regions are formed. Now on this slide you can see how they were clearly grouped. Once you actually put a territory in there, now you've grouped them and you can see where the common region is very clear. Once again, this is an example of how forms and distinctions are made to form contours and shapes so that we have a good form. We can recognize forms. We can operate on forms because that's what we want to do. We want to find forms. We want to name them. We want to form memories about them because that enables us to manipulate these objects in the environment. Here we have the principle of connectedness. And once I connect these dots, they're clearly forming a shape that's distinct from the others. I can look at this and all I can see is barbell shape. I can't look at these. Okay, that's 6 dots and 3 lines, and they're separated from each other and dissociated. I just can't do it. I group them implicitly into 3 forms. I even give them names, the barbell shapes. I can imagine if they were real objects, how I might, grasp them in the middle, and so on. And I have a whole model for how this form is being constructed, and all from the principle of connectedness. Now, clearly, structuralism has no real way of handling this. I mean, in structuralism, you ought to be able to break these forms down into 6 circles and 3 lines. But I can't do that. My perceptual abilities keep me grouping things and making contrast between the figure or the figures that I'm seeing here and the background. Here's another principle called the principle of synchrony. And here, objects are seen together if they change together. So here you've got to imagine you've got this array down here of yellow and black dots, and the yellow ones are turning either clear or they're turning black, and the black ones are turning yellow. And this is being done over time, so it's going to be sort of animated over time. Well, as you see these flickering like this, you're going to definitely group them together because they're changing together. And this is another way of forming a shape or an object based upon a change of stimulus qualities. Here's an example of how groupings influence search. Now here you've got an array here where you've got squares and circles. And what you want to find is where there are two squares together. Well, if you go along the top row, it's very easy to find those two squares together. They form a shape or a form. So they become a grouping. Now, though, when you look at the bottom ones, the two squares in a row are forming different groupings. It's harder to see that they repeat after each other. So if your task was to find these two squares, it's clearly you're able to do it easier in the top array because they're actually forming a shape or a form or group. Whereas in the bottom one they're not, and they're actually harder to find. Now the figure and ground illusion in this became the hallmark of Gestalt psychology. If there's anything identified with Gestalt psychology anymore, it's the figure-ground illusion. And here they did a very interesting thing where they examined the ambiguity of forms and shapes, essentially groupings in good form, based upon the contrast of figure to ground. So the figure is something that's in front of the background. We have a strong bias to perceiving figures and perceiving them in front of backgrounds. That obviously helps us in perception. It helps us in depth perception. It's a very strong cue as to what objects are in front of other objects. So when you act on the objects, you have a good, strong perceptual background for figuring out where the objects are in relation to the other objects in the environment. Well, we're primed to see a figure in front of a background. That's basically what it comes down to. And this illusion makes it ambiguous. That's why it's so fun to look at these. The figure is perceived as an object, and the figure is in front of the ground, in front of the background. The background is uniform. It's unformed, it's homogeneous, and extends beyond the figure. Now take a look at the object here, or the objects here. Now this is either a goblet, if you look at the white and make that the figure, and the goblet has a black background, or it's two faces, two profiles opposing each other, with the white as the background. And because of the ambiguity here, your perception is going to flip back and forth to each one of those. It's going to be very hard to maintain one or the other and inhibit the one that inhibit one of them. Also, the separation contour of the figure and the ground appears to belong to the figure. So the separation contour, the contour that separates the figure from the ground, appears to belong to the figure and certainly not the background. So if I look at it as two faces, the contour of the faces belongs to the faces, and the background extends off in the distance and it's white. If I see it as a goblet, then the contour of the goblet stays with the goblet, and the background is just a homogeneous black background that extends off into space. Now I managed to find a short segment from one of the Simpsons episodes in which they refer to this, and I'm not sure why. I think they're in a science museum, and this is just something they threw into the TV show to make it kind of funny and interesting. But if you go to the course website, you can download that little movie segment. Okay, so we're primed to see a figure in front of a background. We have a figure-ground segregation bias. Symmetry works to influence the perception of the figure in the ground. If you look at this display down below here, you can see where the symmetrical objects tend to become the figures, and the remaining black or white becomes the background. So as I look across these, there's a figure there that looks kind of like a ladder, with a single bar with these blocks that go up. There's a figure that looks like wavy lines. Anyway, when I look across from left to right, I see the black areas as figure because they're represented with symmetrical forms. There's a symmetry there that makes good form, and so I tend to perceive it that way. However, as you progress across this figure, the white becomes symmetrical, and we tend to see the white areas as figures. Now, you can always go back and look at that and make the black areas background. It's possible to do, but it's very hard. We have a tendency to form good form out of symmetry, and this symmetry compels us to see that as the form, as the shape. We tend to see forms as symmetrical, and a lot of things in the world are symmetrical, but we tend to have that as in a spatial array that predisposes us to make that the figure, whereas the background is the asymmetrical parts that are in this form, in this display here. Here's another ambiguous figure in which the figure and the ground are not clear. Area and size also tend to influence the perception of the figure. I probably tend to see the background as being the larger size, and the narrower, the smaller areas as being the figure. Here you look at this figure and you can see it's either a plus sign with the smaller areas. So I can clearly see that if I can see a sort of a plus sign where you have these vertices going down to the center, and the background being the remainder. Or I can look at it and see a cross figure, sort of the with the broad areas being crossing at angles. And it's possible for me to do that, but I tend to flip back to the plus figure, and I tend to have a bias towards seeing that as the figure and the remainder is the background. Although I can see the cross figure, and if you look at this long enough, you can go back and forth. Here in this display, you see the role of orientation, the perception of figure and ground. Now here the areas have been controlled for. The area of the plus sign and the cross are the same. But I still, when I see the plus sign, I still see it having that 90-degree orientation, and the cross having a 45-degree orientation, at least in this one. I want to see forms, though. It's very hard for me to look at this and just see sort of a wheel with spokes. I want to see an internal structure of the plus sign and the cross, especially since I know it's there. Since someone has pointed out, it's been pointed out to me before that they're there, I will tend to see them. I will tend to cluster these things by their angles, and not in this display, and not see this as just disassociated lines in a circle. Here's a display that reinforces the role of meaningfulness and perception of figure and ground. Now just look at this for a while. Look at this display for a while, and you'll notice something happening. Something will pop out at you, and I'm hesitant to tell you because once I tell you what the meaningful element is, maybe it'll happen too fast. But you notice here, if you look at the left figure, the white area begins to look like a letter, and it's the letter W. And as you go across the display here, you can see there are other letters. And once you know that, you tend not to be able to see the figures, the black figures, as figures in the foreground. The letters making up this word become the foreground, become the figure in the foreground, and the black becomes the background. And it's very hard to get out of that because meaningfulness has now produced the form perception for you. And so because there's a memory you have of this word structure and these letters, that biases you towards seeing them in the front with black in the background. Even though on the left side, clearly the black areas look like arrows. And that good form is also biasing you to see the black arrows of any of these black areas as being figures. But once you see the letters, it's very hard to see the black figures as figures again with a white background. Now here I just want to reinforce that the contours, how important they are in Gestalt psychology and how important they are generally in perception. The contours are clearly given to the figures. So the contours are what we're using to formulate what is a figure. So if it's the chalice there, clearly the margins of the chalice become the contours, the thing that we attend to, and the face part becomes background. If you see faces there, their contour becomes very compelling. And that becomes the thing that defines them as a figure, the thing that defines them in the foreground with a white background. So contours are what you want to see in the world. You want to be primed towards seeing contours. Contours are how we define shapes and forms. We tend not to define them very well by their internal structure, but by their external shape and their forms. And when we operate in the environment, we want to be able to operate on objects that are clearly defined by their shape and their form. So we're primed to see that. We tend to enhance contrast that allow us to see forms. And we have lots of memories about how forms should be shaped, which we impose on perception when we can. Now, the role of memories and meaningfulness can't be understated in how we perceive the figure in the ground. The fact that I'm calling this a chalice, that I have a name for it, means that I've seen objects like this before. I've been giving names for them, and I impose that structure on this perception. So I call it a chalice. It has symmetry like a chalice, and that's the best name I can think of to come up with it. The faces and profile, that's an obvious thing that we name, we have associations to. Faces is something that we have a very early experience with, and we discriminate very, very well. But meaningfulness is what the Gestalt psychologists are referring to as essentially a semantics of these objects, which are memories about the objects. They're organized memories, and they tend to be memories that are associated with language, but they impose on our perception, and I'm going to show you some stimuli in the next slide. They clearly indicate this. Well, in this display, what do you see? What is the figure ground separation here? Now, when I look at this, my previous memories, my previous perceptions can pretty much compel me to see this as the sort of half profile or the profile of a woman looking at me or looking away from me. It's kind of ambiguous, but now once I've told you that, it's very hard for you not to see this as that sort of stimulus. It looks like she's got a dress on or a coat, and she's looking away from me or looking toward me, but I have that sort of external profile or silhouette of this object. Now, I've imposed meaning on it, and clearly I've done that. I've imposed memories of how the human form should be represented as a figure. But once I've done that, it really compels me to see the figure in that way. Now, the next slide, we'll see where it's being made even more ambiguous. Now, here, when we've turned it upside down, I think we've taken away the meaningfulness of it. Now I don't have any sort of memories that allow me to perceive this very well. I can go back and forth of perceiving the black as the figure or the white as the figure. The white doesn't seem to have any memories for me. It's very hard to impose order on that white to make it a figure. I can make it a figure if it's kind of abstract and doesn't really have any meaning. It's easy for me to take the black one, I think, because I see this now possibly still as the upside-down woman, but that's very hard to impose on this. So now I'm flipping back and forth. The white is sometimes the figure, the black is sometimes the figure, and I don't really have any meaningfulness cues to help me much with a figure in this form, in this shape.